Welcome to episode 45 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode in the show notes at www.7, all spelled out, so SEVEN, health.com/45.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another installment of Real Health Radio. This week's show, it should have been another one with a guest, but it's actually another solo one. I've actually been away a lot of the last month, and outside of seeing clients, it hasn't left a lot of time available in my schedule. And when recording with a guest, I need to take into account their schedule, and we need to try and work things out, and I've had a couple of things fall through, and then just didn't have the time to rebook people back in for this week. So what I've done is I've put together another show on my own. For anyone who cares about where I've been, I can give you a bit of a brief holiday update and then I can get on with the show. So the first trip, I went to San Sebastian in Spain for 3 days and then drove to Hossegor in the south of France, which is actually only an hour away, and it was for a 5-day surfing holiday. So San Sebastian is absolutely incredible. It has some of the best food in the world, and this is whatever your budget. So very, very small, spending very little, all the way up to like 3 Michelin star restaurants. And basically everywhere you turn in San Sebastian, you have these things called pincho bars. Or pinchos bars. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. But basically they're places that sell like little plates of food, kind of in a similar vein to tapas. So we were there for 3 days, like checking out the city, and this was then interspersed with lots of eating and drinking at place after place after place. And so you just go and you have a couple of plates of food, a bottle of wine, and then you move somewhere else. And it's kind of like a more grown-up version of a pub crawl where you're consuming really great food and wine at the same time. And so it was 3 days of pretty late nights and heavy consumption of alcohol, but it was very, very enjoyable. And so then Hossegor in the south of France was also really enjoyable, but a little disappointing as well. And the reason was, as I mentioned before, we were going for a 5-day surfing holiday, but in the end, we made it in the water for a grand total of 2 hours on one of the days across that whole time. And the first couple of days, the surf was like really choppy and there was no waves in like one certain section. It was just all over the place. And then the whole waves just disappeared and the beach turned into a bay. So there was basically no waves to speak of. So instead of doing surfing, we filled our time by eating lots of pastries, playing golf, went horse riding, played a lot of Scrabble because not only was the surf not great, the weather wasn't also so good a lot of the time, and there was some rain. So my ability to play Scrabble has got better. I now know a lot more of the 2-letter words, which for anyone who plays a lot of Scrabble knows that they pretty much win or lose the game for you. So I don't know what a lot of the 2-letter words mean, but I do know which ones are acceptable and which ones aren't, or at least more of them than I did before. So there were 6 of us who went on the trip and we really had a ball. It was such a great holiday. And so despite the lack of surf in Hossegor, it was a really incredible holiday where it felt like I had some good relaxation. I was really refreshed. So I then came back and I had about 10 days back, and then I was off to Spain again. And this time I went out to Barcelona, and this was more of a working holiday. So from the age of about like 16 or 17, I got into electronic music, and music has really been a big part of my life. So even from when I was 10, 11, 12, like music was a really big thing for me. But previously it'd been bands, and then from like 16, 17 onwards, I was still very much into bands, but also got into electronic music. So whether we're talking about DJs or live acts, and I remember when I first moved to the UK from Sydney being just like in awe of how much of a music scene like London and the UK had. And for the first couple of years, I spent countless weekends in clubs or music venues or at different festivals. And over the last couple of years, like the novelty of being in a club or going to a gig has worn off, and it's not something that happens so much. But I'm very much still into music, and it's a really big part of my life, and also a big part of my group of friends. And pretty much all of my friends I know through music in one form or another. So a number of years ago, when I was still starting out as a nutritionist, I was working for a music website called Resident Advisor. And Resident Advisor, for anyone who's not into electronic music, is basically like the Bible for the scene. I compare it to a Wikipedia in terms of its size and its like ubiquitous nature if you search for anything within that topic of music. But it's then also like the New Yorker or something of that ilk because of the kind of quality of content that they put out. So it is a really big, solid website within that scene. And so the last week, like out in Barcelona, there was the Sonar Music Festival. And it's a music festival that goes for 5 days where they have the official Sonar Music Festival. And then there's lots of other parties around the city, basically like 5 days of parties going on sort of 24/7. And all of those other parties are known as off Sonar. And one of the things that Resident Advisor does is it sells ticket to events. And these tickets then have like QR codes that you then have to sign to scan and use an app to scan them. And so the reason I went out to Barcelona was to be working for Resident Advisor and helping them out, and basically just helping out that tickets and scanning. So I just had to be there and make sure the scanners were working properly, and if there were any issues with the tickets, I could then go into the back end of the system and see what was going on. And so all in all, it was pretty easy work, but it was pretty long days. So I'd start work anywhere between like 11 a.m. and then 3 p.m. And then I'd work through till about like midnight or 1 or sometimes a little later. And then some of the nights I would then go out afterwards and check out some parties and meet up with friends. So there were a number of days where I was functioning off like 4 hours sleep, but it made it much easier when I'm then like spending those days outside in the sunshine, and the work that I was doing was not in any way, shape or form intellectually taxing. So I got a good chance to catch up with lots of friends who are out for the festival, and like really I'd be hard pressed to think of a better working holiday. And it would break me to live like this all the time, but it was nice to do for 6 days, and I had a load of fun. So you are now caught up on all of my holidays, and I've probably given you a little bit of an insight into some of my interests that I haven't really talked about before. So let's get on with the show. And so this one is all about the female menstrual cycle. And it's a topic that lots of people, particularly women, don't really understand. So I want to explain what happens, what are the different organs, what are the different hormones from a physiological perspective, what's going on throughout the cycle. And I will just mention I did a podcast before on reasons why women may be having issues with their cycle, as well as a podcast on like endometriosis and PCOS. So I think both of these could be helpful to listen to as well. So I'm going to link to them in the show notes. So to start with, I'm going to break the menstrual cycle into some little parts so that you can understand it, and then I'll put it back together and we can talk about the bigger picture. So to start with, looking at the organs that are involved in the menstrual cycle. First off, you have the ovaries, and if you're a female, you should have 2 of them. And the purpose of the ovary is to produce an egg. Then you have the next organ, which is the uterus. And it's not so much the uterus that's important per se, but the buildup of blood and nutrients that occur on the uterine wall that's known as the endometrium or the endometrium wall. And this is where the egg is going to implant itself if it becomes fertilized and the embryo then can start growing. Around the egg, as it is developing, there is a large layer that surrounds it called the follicle. And this gets built up during the menstrual cycle, pretty much for the first half of the cycle, which I'll go into. And it's worth keeping in mind the word follicle, as when we get into the hormone section, one of the hormones is called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. And you can then remember that this is what then stimulates that follicle and also the egg. It's the same with the male reproductive system as well, where the sperm is known as the follicle, and so men produce follicle stimulating hormone just like women. In women, it's so that follicle can then get bigger and release, and you have ovulation. For men, it's to produce the sperm. The final organ that I want to mention, really isn't an organ, but it's known as the corpus luteum. And this is actually produced after ovulation. So as the follicle ovulates, the egg is then released out of that follicle into the fallopian tube. And what is then remained behind is that sac that the egg has come out of, which then becomes known as the corpus luteum. And this doesn't appear obviously until the latter part or the second half of the menstrual cycle. And so the follicle then used to hold the egg then comes out, it becomes the corpus luteum. So let's look at then the hormones that are involved in part of the menstrual cycle. And for each, I'll give a little description on what they do, and then I'll put it together more when we look at the big picture view of how things change and progress through the cycle. So the first hormone is called gonadotrophin releasing hormone. And this is produced in the hypothalamus. And that is a section that is in the brain. And the way that it works in terms of the gonadotrophin releasing hormone is it does it in a pulsating fashion. So every 1 or 2 hours, it will pulse and release gonadotrophin releasing hormone for a 5 or 10 minute period. And if we're looking at the hypothalamus, one of its jobs is to monitor certain levels of things going on in the bloodstream and make changes to certain hormones going up or down depending on what's needed. And this isn't just for reproduction, it's for lots of jobs within the body or lots of systems within the body. So your hypothalamus is really looking and monitoring what's going on. And what the hypothalamus does as part of this is it does this job by affecting the pituitary. And the pituitary is another gland that is then located in the brain. So it releases, the hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin releasing hormone, and that then travels to the pituitary. And from that, the pituitary then produces two hormones in relation to reproduction. And these two hormones are follicle stimulating hormone, which is also known as FSH, and luteinizing hormone, which is also known as LH. So follicle stimulating hormone helps the follicle in the ovaries to grow, as the name would suggest. And then luteinizing hormone aids also in terms of the follicle, but a lot in terms of helping the egg that sits inside the follicle to mature. And it's then needed to trigger ovulation and release the egg into the ovary. Both follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone play a role in terms of stimulating the ovary and the egg and the follicle, but they also have a role in then stimulating other hormones. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone go into the bloodstream, and then they travel down to the target organ in the hormone system. So in this situation, when we're talking about women, its target organ is the ovaries. And when it then travels to those target organs in the ovaries, it then stimulates the ovaries to produce two of its own hormones. One of those hormones is estrogen, and the other hormone is progesterone. So estrogen has many roles in the body for reproduction, but also outside of reproduction. But for this podcast, I just want to focus on its reproductive qualities. So estrogen is involved in the onset of puberty, so playing a role in the development of so-called secondary sex characteristics, so things like breasts, pubic and armpit hair. Once a woman is then getting her cycle, estrogen helps with the growth of the uterine lining, but also with the endometrium. And this is especially important in the follicular stage, which is the first half of the cycle. And I'm going to go through the different stages. It's also important with estrogen for ovulation. And this is something I'll also talk about in a minute. Progesterone, like estrogen, has many reproductive and non-reproductive functions. But looking at the reproductive side of things, progesterone helps with the growth of the endometrium. And this is especially in the luteal phase of the cycle, which is the second half of the cycle. And really it prepares the uterus, it prepares the endometrium for implantation by causing changes, so that if there is conception and that egg then makes its way down to the endometrium, then it can then accept that and you can then have the growth of the baby. So if we go through that flow of hormones again, you have gonadotrophin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. This then stimulates the pituitary. The pituitary then produces two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These hormones then travel in the blood and down to the ovary, and they stimulate it to produce two other hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone. This is simplifying things, and there's lots of different feedback mechanisms, whether it be positive or negative, and there's other hormones are involved. But I want to keep this as simple as possible so you can get a grasp of it without confusing you. So when talking about the menstrual cycle, there are three main stages. I mean, most people talk about two main stages, but there's really three. So first is the follicular stage, the second is ovulation, and then the third is the luteal phase. So on average, the menstrual cycle takes about 28 days. And what I'll do is I'll explain what happens when it's too short or too long. But for this example at the moment, let's just assume that it's 28 days. So day 0 through to day 14 is known as the follicular stage. And it's called this because this is a stage where it's really concerned about developing that follicle. And the follicle also includes the egg and that outer sac that is housing the egg, which is the follicle, and both of these grow over time. Around day 14, on average, the follicle then ovulates, and so it ruptures and out comes the egg into the fallopian tube. This then leaves behind the remnant or the sac, which is then known as the corpus luteum. We then enter the luteal phase, which is from day 14 through to day 28. And this phase is really about building up that uterine lining in preparation for implantation if conception actually occurs. So I now want to put this all together and explain how this works over the menstrual cycle and what the different hormones are doing at different times. I will admit that this would probably be easier with a visual aid that you could look at while I'm talking about this stuff, but we're on a podcast, so that's obviously not going to happen. So I'll do my best to describe it so that you can understand it. So from day 0 to day 14, as I just mentioned, is known as the follicular stage. And just so you know, like day 1 is the first day of a woman's period, and so it then goes on from there. So while a woman is having her period, from that day 1 stage, the body is already underway in preparing the next egg and the next follicle for that next cycle. So from basically day 1 onwards, the egg and the follicle is getting bigger and bigger and growing as that time goes on. And I really should say follicles and eggs because it's not just one. So the ovary actually produces many follicles in that first part of the month. And it's then typically around about day 5 to day 7 that they'll become like one really dominant follicle. And this is known as the Graafian follicle. And this will then continue to develop from this point onwards up into ovulation, while all of the other ones that had started to develop, they'll get like reabsorbed back into the ovary and they'll just then disappear. So the reason for the development of that follicle is really follicle stimulating hormone. So over the first 10 or so days, follicle stimulating hormone is slowly increasing. And so it's therefore stimulating that follicle to also grow. If you're to look at luteinizing hormone during this time, it is being produced, but its production is pretty steady for the first 10 to 12 days. So it's fairly constant. So there is decent amounts coming out, but it's pretty constant. And what this is doing is it's helping with that egg maturation, but it's doing it in a much more reduced way. At around about day 12, something then interesting happens. So around day 12, luteinizing hormone, which has been traveling along, as I said, at that pretty constant level, suddenly has this large spike. And this spike can last anywhere from about 24 to 48 hours. And it's this spike that causes the egg to then completely mature and for the membrane of the follicle to become thinner before it finally ruptures, with the egg then coming out and making its way into the fallopian tube. What has actually caused that spike in luteinizing hormone is actually an increase in estrogen. So if we go back to the start of the follicular stage and day 1 of the cycle, estrogen is basically at its lowest point of really any point over the 28 days of a woman's cycle. So during a woman's period, estrogen is pretty low, but it starts to come up. And once the old uterine lining has been shed, which is what the period is, the body then has to start getting back to building up a new one in case this month is the month that conception actually happens, and that uterine lining is going to be really important. So really from about day 4 to day 6, estrogen starts to climb up. And this increase in estrogen starts to build up that new endometrium. Part of the reason that estrogen is then rising is because it is actually being produced by the follicle. So as the follicle is increasing in size because it's being stimulated by that follicle stimulating hormone, so do the levels of estrogen start to be increased because there's more of the follicle, so it's being able to produce more of the estrogen, and so those estrogen levels go up. When estrogen hits some decisive point, because you can see it just keep going up and up and up, and this is roughly around day 12 or so, somewhere in that ballpark, it's like it turns on a switch with luteinizing hormone. And we see that luteinizing hormone, as I said earlier, around that day 12 mark somewhere, starts to then peak very sharply. And this is then what can help to cause ovulation. So you have that increase in estrogen, that then leads to an increase in luteinizing hormone, and then that leads to ovulation. In fact, there's really a peak in all of the hormones prior to ovulation. So you'll see that there's actually a little mini peak in follicle stimulating hormone, and there's also an increase in progesterone. And this increase in progesterone seems to be pretty necessary for ovulation. So I know when people are talking about hormones, especially around ovulation, the focus is normally always on luteinizing hormone or estrogen and luteinizing hormone, because these are the hormones that really come up the most and come up most sharply. But all of the 4 main hormones have a role in ovulation occurring, and all of them will come up in some way prior to ovulation. So after that ovulation has occurred, you then have that sac that is left behind, what used to be the follicle, and that turns into the corpus luteum. And for the first couple of days after ovulation, the corpus luteum is quickly getting bigger and bigger. And while the follicle was under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone in the first half of the cycle, during the second half of the cycle, when it's now become the corpus luteum, it is largely being influenced by luteinizing hormone. And so, as I mentioned, you have that really sharp rise of luteinizing hormone that causes the ovulation. You then have another couple of days while that luteinizing hormone is coming down. And that high amount of luteinizing hormone creates a situation where the corpus luteum is continuing to get bigger and bigger. And why this is then important is because of progesterone production, which is pretty much the hormone I've talked the least about so far. So progesterone is a hormone that is very much concerned with the luteal, or the second half of the cycle, if we're talking about it from a reproductive perspective. And so I know earlier that I mentioned that the ovaries produce both estrogen and progesterone, which is true, but the production of the progesterone for the cycle is mostly done by the corpus luteum, which is attached to the ovary. So the same way as estrogen is largely produced from the growing follicle, in terms of the progesterone, it's largely produced by that corpus luteum. So progesterone's rise in the second half of the cycle, which is quite a sharp rise, quite a big rise, is almost entirely down to that corpus luteum. So if ovulation doesn't occur for some reason, then that increase in progesterone also doesn't happen in the second half of the cycle. So after you have ovulation, and then there's those couple of days after the corpus luteum is rapidly increasing, progesterone production is also rapidly increasing. And part of the reason why this is important is needed to then continue the production of the endometrium. If you look at the endometrium wall during the cycle, estrogen helps to build it up in the first half of the cycle. But after ovulation, estrogen levels start to go down and go down quite sharply. And so the wall should start to fall apart, but it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't happen is because after ovulation, the corpus luteum takes over and starts then producing lots of progesterone. And the progesterone then takes over this role of continuing to produce and increase the endometrium. I should also say that estrogen does start to then come back up in that second half of the cycle. So you have a couple of days where there's that lull after ovulation, but it starts to then come back up. And it never gets to the height that it got to around that spike with ovulation, but it does start to increase. And part of the reason for why this starts to increase is because the corpus luteum, not only does it produce progesterone, it also produces some estrogen. And so it, in that second half of the cycle, is producing the progesterone and the estrogen that then keep that endometrium wall healthy. But after a number of days in that luteal phase, your luteinizing hormone starts to drop down and starts to drop down quite rapidly. So the corpus luteum at that stage, it stops growing. And now at this point for the cycle can really go one of two ways. So the first is you can then get like menstruation, you can get your period, and the second is if conception occurs. So I want to look at these two separately, and so the first one is let's look at what happens with menstruation. So as I said, like the luteinizing hormone production has now stopped, and the corpus luteum has stopped growing. And despite the fact that the luteinizing hormone has stopped, the corpus luteum is still producing progesterone, and it's continuing to maintain that uterine wall or endometrium wall. But after about 10 days of producing progesterone, if conception hasn't occurred, the corpus luteum starts to degenerate and it starts to decay. And it then degenerates into a thing called the corpus albicans, which is a tiny mass of fibrous scar tissue that will remain on the ovary. And with the degrading and then disappearing of that corpus luteum, progesterone production starts to decline sharply. Estrogen levels also start to decline. And because you're in a situation where you don't have the estrogen, you don't have the progesterone, there's nothing to then maintain that endometrium. So there's nothing to really support its structure. And then when these hormones drop to a certain level, the endometrium begins to break down and we get menstruation, which is the shedding of that endometrium lining. So let's then look at what happens if conception actually occurs. Because if this happens, obviously the process goes a different way. So if a sperm comes in contact with a fertilized egg, we now have a new hormone that gets starting to be produced. And this hormone is HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotrophin, so much easier to just say HCG. This hormone is the little dipstick pregnancy test hormone that you're looking for. So when people pee on the stick, it's trying to see, is there any HCG? And the purpose of HCG is that it takes over the role of luteinizing hormone and it continues to maintain that corpus luteum. So HCG is a luteinizing hormone analog, meaning that it binds to luteinizing hormone receptors. It does a very similar role. And this means that it continues to stimulate that corpus luteum to grow and to persist, which means that you continue to produce the progesterone and the estrogen, which means you then maintain that endometrial wall. So the fertilized egg can then hopefully continue down the fallopian tube and make its way into the uterus, and then it can implant on that endometrial wall. So the corpus luteum does the role of stimulating that progesterone and the estrogen production for roughly the first trimester. And it's then after this that its role is taken over by the placenta, and then the placenta does that role. And this can be part of the reason why women can start feeling better after that first trimester, because the placenta is taken over. And obviously, with the placenta, sometimes it can be producing more of those hormones that actually help someone to be feeling better. There's lots of different reasons why someone can be not feeling so good or getting nausea or morning sickness or those kind of things. But typically, for most women, they will find that after that first trimester, they start to feel much better. And this is definitely the case with the women that I've worked with. If people do have a tough first trimester, if they start and are doing the right things by the second trimester, things are much easier for them. And a lot of that is down to the placenta. So there it is. Like, that is the very basic stripped back version of how the menstrual cycle works. I'd say you now know more than like 99.9% of the population on what goes on during that time. A couple of things I just want to mention. So firstly, as you probably know, the menstrual cycle is not always 28 days as it should be. For some, it could be 3 weeks, while for others, it's 5 or 6 weeks. For others, it's like totally irregular or they're not getting their period at all. But if we're just looking at either long or short cycles, the second half of the cycle is normally the part that is more constant. So meaning the point from which someone ovulates to the point at which they get their period is normally fairly consistent of being about 14 days plus or minus a day or two each way. So what this means is that if someone is having, say, a 3-week cycle, they are then typically going to be having a much shorter follicular phase. So the first part of the cycle, with much more minor changes in the luteal phase, the second half. If someone's having, say, a 5-week cycle, they'll be typically having a much longer follicular stage with only it having minor changes to the luteal phase or the second half of the stage. So really, it's that first half that normally gets longer or shorter, and the second half stays the same more often than not. The second thing to keep in mind with this, and I think this is particularly important given cycles that are shorter or longer, is that just because someone gets their period doesn't mean that they have ovulated. So unless follicle stimulating hormone is doing what it should be doing, unless you're having that surge of estrogen and luteinizing hormone and progesterone, ovulation doesn't occur. And so when this happens when this doesn't happen and these hormones aren't where they should be and ovulation doesn't occur, it's known as an anovulatory cycle. So this means sometimes when people are having problems with their cycle, say it being too short or too long, or even with it's in the correct amount of time, they haven't necessarily ovulated. And this is going to greatly reduce that amount of progesterone in that second half of the cycle because, as I said, there is no corpus luteum, so you're not going to be having that progesterone be produced in that second half of the cycle. And while anovulatory cycles aren't the only reason for someone having very long cycles or very short cycles, it is definitely something to keep in mind. And a clue would be if you are having very light periods, this could point towards it because obviously once you ovulate and you then have the progesterone production and you have that second half of the cycle, that's when the endometrium is built up to a much higher level. So if the cycle or the period is very light, it could point towards the fact that you haven't really had that second half of the cycle. But it's really difficult to tell just based on those symptoms. But I would say if someone is having long, short, or irregular cycles, it's probably something to keep in mind. And when I do say this, my comments are in regards to someone who is not on some form of hormonal contraception. So if someone is taking hormonal contraception, the typical thing that it does and the way that it prevents you getting pregnant is that it creates anovulatory cycles. So it creates high amounts of estrogen and or progesterone. So in a sense, the body thinks it's already pregnant, or at least because of these hormones, it prevents that LH or the luteinizing hormone spike that would normally stimulate ovulation. So that's the way that hormonal contraceptions work, is they prevent ovulation from occurring. So that is it for this podcast on the female menstrual cycle. I know that I've mentioned lots of different hormones and different organs, and you may not have heard of them all before, But even if this was the case, I hope I've been able to explain it in a way that you were still able to follow and that you have a better understanding of what is going on with the menstrual cycle. Next week, I will be back with a guest. And until then, I hope you have a really good week, and I'll catch you soon.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.